So we'll just start as we normally do, just by kind of settling the mind a little and just taking a moment to sit comfortably, maybe with the eyes gently closed or slightly open. Just kind of move into a different mode, a different space. Letting go of thoughts of the day, concerns, worries, plans. Try to bring ourselves into the present. So we can just follow the respiration, follow any sensations that accompany the in-breath and the out-breath, particularly in the space around the nostrils. And just try to notice if anything that isn't that present moment physical sensation is arising in the mind, and noticing those distractions. We just lift our attention up from them, not energizing or following them, and keeping our attention on whatever physical sensations naturally accompany the in-breath and the out-breath. And then just on your own, try to set an altruistic motivation. Trying to situate your efforts in a broader context of trying to develop good qualities that aren't only for one's own benefit alone, but thinking how those good qualities enable us to benefit others. And thinking that's also a large part of our motivation. All right. Good afternoon. Happy Friday. So this is class 3. We'll be halfway through by the time we finish today. We've covered really, I think, through the chapter on attitude. It's sort of where we ended last week. Did anyone, before we move on, did anyone have a thought or a question from prior material?
No, thank you.
So the next chapter does go in a little bit, perhaps we could say slightly a different direction, but still, I would say that the through line for all of these chapters and for the course is really putting effort and emphasis on changing the definition of happiness and thinking of it, as we've said before, really not thinking of it as something that we receive or as an excitation that occurs in dependence upon, largely external factors, but thinking of it as part of the mind itself, thinking of it as a stable and reliable aspect of our own mind that through effort and through cultivation, we can develop and that we can grow and that we can stabilize and that we can come to depend on and see as something that pervades every part of our lives and isn't that kind of unstable and more capricious sense of happiness that depends entirely on things working out in a particular way or receiving a particular circumstance or good of some kind. So in the next chapter is called Peace, chapter 5. And in this chapter, although it's a little bit different, it goes in a little bit different direction. Here, Lama Zopa is going to encourage us to think about the relationship between the quality of our mind and also the contentment of our mind, but in a way also what we can bring. That's another aspect of this, is taking the narrow egocentric perspective and trying to work with that energy and taking that as best we can, reducing that and taking that out of the equation as best we can, and then learning to work with that and developing that as a skill and a familiarity that deepens over time as well. So this idea of peace, he says, that it is our own loving kindness that provides happiness to all beings. So when we think of our interdependence and our interrelationship with others, we can think of that in terms of our family, and then broadly our community, and then even going out to the society and so on. And thinking of the stability and the harmony of those units as being dependent upon the minds that comprise those units. And it's true, of course, that it's only really our mind that we have any control over. But starting to think about interdependence and interrelationship with respect to what is it that when I go to work or when I meet with my friends or when I interact in a family gathering, what is it that I'm contributing to that interaction? And how does that kind of ripple outward in larger and larger ways? So here he says each of us is completely responsible for the happiness of every other sentient being. So it's true, I think, of course, that we can't require or we can't force other sentient beings to achieve happiness, but we can think about when I'm interacting with other sentient beings, my choices, my decisions, my actions, how do those contribute toward the happiness of all other of those sentient beings? And taking responsibility then for how do we choose to relate to others, and when we relate to others, are we relating in a way that is at least on some level contributing to the happiness of others, meaning that we see them not through the lens of what they do for us, but we see them on an equal footing with us, and that we wish for their happiness and we wish for their freedom from suffering. And so our interaction is going to be focused more on trying to provide rather than trying to receive. Um, so that's, yeah, Deborah. You're muted, sorry.
Yes, just a question about this, which can sometimes be a little confusing with how, one thinks in the West, but like, for example, here we're taught, we're mostly taught that we're responsible just for ourselves. We only have the control of that responsibility and not of others. But in this case, I guess if we're responsible for ourselves, if we treat ourselves well, then we will have that ripple effect with other beings. But it's not that we're responsible of other people's happiness.
So there are different levels to this. What I would say is that when we say that we take responsibility for the happiness of others, what we mean is that we do have, because of our interdependence and our interrelationship with others, we have an effect on others. And to the extent that our own mind is not yet well controlled, we will continue to be under the influence of states of mind that are not going to be as beneficial or as useful for others. We're to the extent that our minds are familiar with less useful states, less beneficial, less constructive states, that is going to necessarily play a role in every interaction, every relationship, every time that we are in relationships with others, whether they're strangers, whether they're close friends. It doesn't, the fact that our own minds aren't as well pacified, aren't as well controlled, aren't as well developed as they could be, then that means that, at least to some degree, we have some less than positive impact on others. So when we try to commit ourselves to a path of growth and a path of development, then that means that, of course, we will continue to make mistakes for a long time. We will most certainly continue to make mistakes for the remainder of this entire life. But when we commit ourselves to a path of growth and development, what we're suggesting to ourselves and saying to ourselves is that we want to make fewer mistakes. We want to be able to have more constructive, more beneficial relationships with others. And of course, that, it's still up to others also to make constructive choices, to make beneficial choices. And we can't force that on others. But what we can do is take responsibility for the piece of it that we do control, for being a model for others, as you're suggesting, and then also being responsible for how the content of our minds impacts on those around us. And then, to some degree, of course, Buddhism would say that, we can limitlessly develop our potential. And when we do that, then we're incredibly well suited to be of extraordinary benefit to others. But still, even then, the Buddha said that enlightened beings can only point the way. They can only demonstrate what is to be practiced and what is to be, cast aside, what is to be adopted and what is to be rejected. Still, sentient beings, of course, have a choice, and we can't, make that choice for others.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
So the next chapter is called Compassion. Compassion in Buddhism is the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. So this is one of Lama Zopa's, I think, maybe most famous kind of quotes on this. This is really something FPMT was just recently saying, that this particular presentation or idea is something that Lama Zopa really wants centers to be helping people to try to connect with. So the idea that the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings should pervade a person's life, should be the principal motivating factor in everything that we do, that in a way what it means to live a spiritual life is to try to integrate the aspiration for all sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering, so that we should live with that, we should work and we go to work with that, and that, during the time of death, that the most protective, most beneficial kind of mindset to have is to recollect that, and then that should form the basis of why we are trying to meditate, why we are trying to develop our qualities. And then even here, the last two, when we meet with conducive circumstances and when we meet with adversive circumstances, that even those we try to transform into the path of generating compassion, that wanting sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering should really be the baseline that we're trying to familiarize our mind with. So again, this is just reiterating these quotes here are reiterating again the notion that happiness is a sense of inner contentment, a sense of inner strength and stability that comes from remembering the practice of compassion and kindness, and And that really the only way in which we can ultimately have a state of mind that is able to be beyond, that's able to grow beyond only responding to what happens, and is able to be stable in a way that means that it's present irrespective of what's happening, is to take our daily life as the ground in which we try to develop these qualities. So, here he's saying in every interaction, we need to guard the mind. We need to, in an earlier chapter, he says that often it's often the things that occur to us to do are kind of just the messenger of the ego. And they're not the messenger of the higher aspect of the mind, the more so like the ideal of the bodhisattva, the ideal of a real courageous spiritual practitioner that we might be trying to grow toward. So here, I think that is this aspect of being careful, questioning why a particular idea or particular motivation is occurring to us, and checking, trying to come back to our motivation of kindness, and checking, am I operating from the perspective in this interaction of looking at this other person as a means to something that I would desire? Or am I looking at this interaction, this opportunity, as a vehicle for growth, as a vehicle to deepen what I'm trying to be more like? So he says that it's the first thing that we should remember, and the first thing to practice. And then he says, of course, that in many ways, all of these things, here compassion is the one example, but in his book, like How to Practice, Lama Zopa makes the point that a lot of the messages that we get from society, and a lot of the templates for behavior and action that we see mirrored in broader society, are not really conducive to our own commitment, our own inner path. And so even if we don't see these traits being reflected in society, we have to still try to keep coming back to a sense of courageousness, a sense of determination, that I don't need to see this being mirrored in my society in order for me to be confident that it's the right path for me, that this is what I have chosen for myself. And, I can see it reflected in my teachers, in the great masters. And so that is my ideal. That is the benchmark and the mirror that I'm going to decide for myself I'm going to keep coming back to, rather than trying to find it in society at large. Any thoughts or questions so far?
Yes, I have one regarding die with compassion, and you talked about to recollect. So do you mean that if we're aware that we're dying, we just have to go over our life on how we lived our life, like you said, how we worked our life, if we enjoyed our life, how if we meditated. That's what you mean by the recollection of dying with compassion.
So, it's a very broad topic, and the FPMT does have a Discovering Buddhism module on death and rebirth that maybe, that at some point maybe the center will, I'm sure, has offered and will offer again. So that might be something to, when that is on the schedule, then maybe really trying to do that module, because there is a whole module on all of the things that are really important. But Buddhism, broadly speaking, does say that the mind that arises around the time of death does play a very crucial role in the process of rebirth. So, but of course, it's also, it's true that people die in different ways. And so the ideal, but of course it's not up to us, we don't know how it's going to unfold. So in one way, what Buddhism would say is that to use our life, while we are alive, while we're vital and alive, and we can make choices and we can meditate and we can study and so on, the way in which we use the majority of our days in our life, that has a profound impact. So that is, in a way, the one thing that we do have complete control over, is waking up every day and then deciding, okay, well, I woke up and I have today. How am I going to use today? Tomorrow we wake up again, and again we have a choice. And if we can transform all of the remaining days that we have, that's profoundly beneficial in terms of that momentum, in terms of that the collective power of that continued effort. If we have the opportunity to, as you're saying, kind of know that we're ill, know that there's not much more time, then to try to hold the mind in beneficial, constructive states intentionally is really useful. So that could be, there are meditations that specifically engender kind of the sense of compassion. So doing those, and of course, that means that we use our life also to do those, because during the time of death, we need to have a great level of familiarity already. It's kind of too late at that time to sort of, it's never too late, really. It's better than, if that is what we have, that's better than not doing it. But it's ideal to have a great deal of familiarity already, because the time of death is more challenging than other times. So the things that we're most familiar with, are the things that will be arising naturally. So you could try to do specific meditations at that time, or as you're saying, recollect actions that you engaged in that were beneficial, whatever you can do to try to hold the mind in a peaceful, calm state that is directed at benefiting others, is extremely beneficial around the time of death.
Thank you.
So that the previous chapter was on compassion in general. The next chapter is a more challenging iteration or way of practicing compassion. Here, compassion for people that we find difficult, and the traditional. The word enemy is not kind of Lama Zopa's word. It is a sort of common translation or a common way, but it means a difficult person, a person that we find, um, you know, people that we don't want to associate with, people that we feel like are acting against our interests. This is the group of people for whom it is the most challenging to feel a sense of compassion toward. So that's the subject of this next chapter. But he points out that when we're stuck in a way of relating, even to these people, even to people that we feel like are difficult, when we, if we don't commit ourselves to trying to work with this, then we will continue to relate to people that we feel like are working against us. We will continue to relate to them through a sense of aversion, through a sense of hostility at times. And that, what Lama Zopa here, he's saying that is really, in a way, only harming oneself. That it's not true that, when normally we think that when that person is acting in ways that I disagree with, that I find difficult, that aren't meeting my expectations, we normally define that as what is harming me. We think this person outside of myself who's acting contrary to my preferences, that is what is harmful. But Lama Zopa here is really encouraging us to try to think about the fact that it's our response to that that's harmful, and it's harmful to ourselves. That when we respond to that with hostility, it's the hostility that is harmful to our mind. It's harmful to our spiritual growth. It's harmful to our staying in contact with peace of mind, with contentment. And it's harmful to developing a relationship with that person that would, that there's an opportunity there to reach out and to have a relationship, even in the face of them acting at cross purposes, or how we think of it as acting at cross purposes with our desires. And that all of this is really, here he's saying that all of this is really based on the mental habit or the mental predisposition of anger, or viewing circumstances that are not how we would prefer them to be, viewing that as something that we must be separate from, that we must remove from our experience. If we allow that way of thinking to be predominant in the mind, that gives rise to the designation of enemy. And without that operating in the mind, the designation of enemy itself isn't something that appears to the mind. So this is really kind of, in a way, going back to this idea of taking responsibility for trying to benefit others, because those that we find it difficult to benefit exist because of the way in which we're choosing to view their actions in our own mind. And if we choose to view those actions in a bit of a different way, then the categories of, these are the people I want to benefit. These are the people that maybe, if it's not so difficult, and if I can find a way that maybe it's useful to me, then maybe I'll benefit. And these are the people that there's almost no chance that I'll ever work to benefit. All of those categories, we think, kind of our mind has the view that those are external categories that we're responding to. And Lama Zopa is really encouraging us to think about the fact that these are constructions that we're actually responsible for. And when we take responsible for them, we can make them be different. And when we make them be different, then the way in which we respond to others naturally, spontaneously, and deeply shifts in really beneficial and positive ways. So here he's saying, that there's no action. So the first thing that he said, was that there's no harm to oneself that doesn't come from one's own mind. And then he's saying, if an action harms any other being, even your enemy, it harms you. So he's trying to really drive that point home again by saying that anything that we do, any action that we take that interferes with any sentient being is actually something that harms us. We think that, we might think that it's that by engaging in that action, people engage in actions because they think it will bring about their own welfare. We think that when we yell at the person or when we, then we're sort of teaching them not to respond in a particular way. And then they don't. And then we feel like we navigated that in a way that worked out well for us because we got angry with them. And then we feel like they responded to that by moderating their behavior in a way that now we're more comfortable. And so we kind of learn this really destructive cycle of, in a way, kind of manipulating others and just trying to make things work out for our own preferences, rather than. So that's using the lens of this is external to me and I have no choice but to see it in a particular way. And so the only way that I can fix this is to shift what's happening outside of myself. And all of these insights that Lama Zopa is presenting us with are taking a completely different view. And they're encouraging us to think about, how am I constructing my view of what's happening on the basis of what my mind is familiar with? And then how do I train my mind to be familiar with something else so that what's happening outside of me doesn't appear as harmful, doesn't appear as something that I have to alter. And here he's suggesting that even if someone develops hatred toward us, we should try to see that person as an object of compassion. So here in the book, what he points out is that the only way that we can really work with this and ultimately try to be successful with this, because this is, of course, very challenging, very difficult. But the process by which we can be successful with that is to separate a person's actions from their real essence, from the nature of their mind itself. So we try to hold the idea of the person as a mind, as a consciousness that at its core, at its most essential essence, is not stained by the mistaken ideas or conceptions or views that are that are causing them to perhaps act in unskillful or destructive ways. So thinking about, yes, this person might have developed familiarities or ideas or ways of acting that are bringing about actions that are detrimental, maybe to myself, maybe to others. But that's a very surface, superficial way of thinking about this other person. And I have to try to separate that from their real essence. Just like I want to think about myself as someone who's capable of evolving beyond the mistakes that I make. Because I make, we all ordinary beings are making all kinds of mistakes, all day, every day. And I'm not making all of the mistakes that I'm judging this other person for making. Maybe they're making more intense mistakes, or they're making mistakes more often, perhaps, or maybe perhaps I'm not fully aware of all of the ways in which I also make mistakes. But in the same way that I try to think of myself as capable of growing beyond that, we need to try to cultivate the view that all other sentient beings are capable of evolving beyond that. And really then thinking only that, when I make a mistake, it's because my mind is too close, too familiar with a way of thinking that's not beneficial, not that I've learned or become familiar or internalized or habituated myself to a tendency, to a habit, to a way of being that's not constructive. And that is something that all sentient beings are doing, but all sentient beings at their core, at their true essence, are capable of moving beyond that, which means that that when it arises in my own mind, that I can respond to that with compassion, and when it arises in the mind of another sentient being, I can respond to that with compassion. It's not, none of these ideas are easy. None of this happens quickly, but the more that we can remember that and keep coming back to that, and deepening that in meditation, and then trying to recollect it in daily life, then it will become more of a second nature to us. Any thoughts or questions so far? I'm sorry,
Yes.
Deborah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I've really understood what you've said, and it's been great. It's really helped me a lot. and I hope I can pose this question so that you may understand me. So what happens, like, for example, applying this but to oneself, like, let's say in the mornings, because of life circumstances, or because what one thinks, like I think that somebody has done that has affected me, how can I have compassion for self that will help me transform to be able to want to face the day and not think of the external, more for oneself?
So, I mean, again, so I don't think that there's any really quick fixes. Lama Zopa does recommend there's a practice that he encourages, sometimes at the center, sometimes the evening meditation or the morning meditation. Teachers might use aspects. That's called, that practice by Lama Zopa is the method to transform a suffering life into happiness. It's one of the practices that he really encourages people to work with. So there are, in that practice, there are contemplations that a person is meant really upon waking. So as you're saying, I think it is really helpful to very, very shortly after we wake up, because as you're saying, we keep forgetting. It's very easy, in the moment, on the cushion in meditation, it's very relatively easy to have a moment where we, yes, we want to do something, or we have all of this energy, all of this enthusiasm. But then as we go through life, it wanes. It's not always as stable. But of course, the solution is just that we have to keep having sessions throughout every single day. We have to keep reiterating, so we can try to take 5 minutes at lunch. We can try to take, 5 minutes maybe once we park and before we go into work, 5 minutes after we leave the building and we're in the car before we um, leave the parking lot to go back home. We need to, we don't need to, but it's, I think, really helpful, really, useful to try to identify in my day, what are these times that I can take out of my day to do like a mini meditation, to take 5 minutes, take 10 minutes, and reassert these things. And so that practice, there's a lot of morning, he says that really, literally, perhaps while we're still in bed, that we could have a printout of the method to transform a suffering life into happiness on the nightstand, and literally do some of it before we even get out of bed. And then, wash up, and then maybe do like a 10-minute session before going to work. And it's really, and then, of course, we have to be patient with ourselves. We have to realize that we're not going to transform in a month. We're not going to transform in a year. But that transformation, that there isn't anything mystical. There isn't anything other than today. There isn't anything other than this, the choices that I make in this day, that gives rise to that transformation. So how can I find a repeatable, workable process for having 2 or 3, or more of these times when I'm recollecting these things? And then, just taking it seriously and doing it again and again. But here you're talking, your question is sort of about courageousness and And that does have to come from kind of a decision, an intentional decision, that the real purpose of my life is spiritual growth and development. That I do many things, but that's the real point of why I have the rest of my life. And then we have to try to relate. We kind of have to try to find in every interaction, in every moment, how do I use this to accomplish that goal? How do I bring that back to that goal? And then, when we make mistakes, when we can purify, I don't know, we have purification practice at the center in the evenings. So when we, make mistakes, we try to purify those mistakes. And when we act in unskillful ways, we can do a session of meditation where we rehearse having acted skillfully instead of unskillfully. What would it have been like had I not lost my temper? What would it have been like if I had said a kind thing instead of an unkind thing? And then just realizing that it's a slow process.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
The next chapter is called The Good Heart. And this is, again, I think, directly kind of also part of what we're talking about here. So this will probably be what we end on here. Lama Zopa is asking us, the question, again, that question, as I was saying, the sort of through line of the Course is changing the idea that happiness is an excitation that can only happen sometimes, that happiness is a momentary coming together of something, and then it goes. It kind of comes and then it goes, and it's largely outside of my control. He's posing the question, what if any kind of peace, any kind of contentment is something that can be internal to one's own experience. And then he relates that to the decision, again, as I was saying, the intentional choice, the intentional decision that the real essence of my life is the term, the specific term that he's using here is to cherish others. But that's part of, that's in a way largely what we mean by spiritual growth and development. We can define spiritual growth and development by the yardstick of how much do I really cherish all sentient beings? How much do I view sentient beings as a method for getting what I want versus how much do I view sentient beings as being complete in themselves and seeing them as having their own interests, their own goals, their own aspirations, and wanting for them to have all of the temporary and the ultimate desires and causes of true happiness and true peace within their own mind. And what he's saying here, and as I mentioned, that practice, how to, the method to transform a suffering life into happiness, that mind training practice is about cutting the root. Because again, this idea of problems, in the same way that the idea of enemy, the idea of problems is not an unavoidable construct of reality. It is something that we layer on top of reality by what our mind is familiar with. And he's saying that when the mind is absorbed in a concentration on cherishing others, then that kind of spacious, courageous, open-hearted willingness to embrace others completely eliminates what we would call a problem, completely eliminates that problems result from the narrow, constricted ego identity that we're just most familiar with at present. And that the vehicle of overcoming that is to think about that others are not there, don't exist to provide us with what we would prefer. That they are complete in and of themselves, and that when I view them as such, and when I simply wish, may they be free of suffering, and may they have all temporary and ultimate happiness. And when I keep coming back to that again and again and again, my mind opens up. My mind is not constricted and painful, and things don't, challenging circumstances are opportunities for growth rather than these things, these problems that I must separate myself from. So that's kind of the courageousness that you were talking about, that comes from just doing our best to recognize that some states of our own mind are narrow and constricted and cause us pain, separate us from our contentment. And then also, when they arise, we're more likely to be hostile to some sentient beings. We're more likely to be jealous or to have ill will or to perhaps be deceitful. We're more likely to engage in actions that cut us off from others, that don't help us to have constructive, open interactions and relationships with others. And that all of this is something that we can start to try to think about taking responsibility for, and then slowly over time learning how to make better choices, and then studying and meditating and doing the things that will actually transform us into the kind of person that finds it very easy to have that kind of courageous attitude, to relate to others with that more open-hearted way of being. So, any final thoughts or questions today?
Hello, Venerable. I'm finding these teachings so useful, particularly because I'm in the midst of quite heavy, serious, ongoing, prolonged, dramatic situations. And some of these finer points, I can regularly forget. Also with dealing with other people, my expectations of them to have, these morals, standards, professionalism. And there's something you said in your first teaching which it really tickles me, kind of breaks this anger that can, come on me, is I continue to be violated by my unrealistic expectations. and as I say, for the weight of what I'm experiencing, it's such an instant lift. Working quite closely with someone who knows the ins and outs as much, and out of everyone coming to this kind of level, quite explanatory level, is helping me and just giving me those little reminders, no matter how big or small or how long I've been doing or been involved in Dharma, particularly with, when people are studying about emptiness, and those kinds of deeper levels. And I think it's lost, the compassion side is lost, and you do have a responsibility for your fellow being as well. It might be the illusion, but it still matters. This phenomena still exists, doesn't it? It still actually matters. It really brings some realism and some tangible compassion, even if you like. So I do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Venerable. This has been so insightful. Thank you.
All right. So we'll just end then with a sort of sense of dedication. So we recollect the altruistic motivation that we established at the beginning, and that we think that whatever positive energy that we've generated in our own mind, we just offer that energy for the benefit of all sentient beings. Not holding on to it, not using that to kind of feel that we've accomplished something, but to just let it go completely. Thinking, may that energy ripen in whatever way is beneficial for sentient beings. May it serve as a cause and a condition for me to fully develop, fully awaken my potential, so that I can be of even the highest benefit to all sentient beings, without exception, without regard to friend, enemy, and stranger. All right.
Thank you so much, Venerable.
Thanks for coming. Have a good weekend.
You too.
See you
Thank
next